those of you who aren't aware what the Black Cat House is, we are an organization here in Lincoln, Nebraska, dedicated to educating ourselves and the community about oppressive power structures and how to dismantle them. You can learn more about what we do at our website, which is theblackcathouse.org. We host a variety of events, including reading discussions, panels, and more, and you can find those posted on our website and on our Facebook page. So be sure to check those out when you get the chance. So tonight, Black Cat House is partnering with OutNebraska to discuss Title 11, which is also sometimes known as the Fairness Ordinance. OutNebraska is a community organization dedicated to empowering, celebrating, and growing LGBTQIA2S+ communities in Nebraska. As an organization, OutNebraska advocates for reform, grows connections, encourages civic engagement, and makes investment for the betterment of our communities. I'm really pleased, and we're all very pleased to welcome Aaron with OutNebraska tonight to talk to us about Title 11, its history, what it means for Nebraskans of all genders and sexualities. We know that this is a really complicated issue that a lot of people are wondering about. So our goal tonight is to learn more about Title 11 and what steps we can take as a community to fight non-discrimination in Nebraska and Lincoln specifically. So this discussion is actually going to happen in 3 parts. The first portion will be informational. Aaron's going to give us a brief explanation on Title 11 and what it means for us. We do want this information to be accessible to a broad audience. So as I said before, the first part of tonight's conversation will be recorded and publicly posted to our YouTube page. For audience members who are concerned about confidentiality, your names and faces will not be present in that recording. We know that this is, a sensitive issue for a lot of people. So we just want to make sure that you know that you are not going to be plastered anywhere. So the second portion will be a question and answer session. We're going to take all questions via the chat so that everybody has a chance to speak up, especially those folks who have concerns with confidentiality. So when part 2 starts, please make sure to open the chat screen by clicking the speech bubble button in the controls along the bottom of the screen. We'll also be recording the Q&A session to make available later as well. We want to emphasize here that there are no stupid questions. We're all here to learn more and gain more information about Title 11 and non-discrimination. Please assume that all questions come from basic curiosity and with good intentions. And please also respect each other and the space as a place of learning and of dialogue. So finally, the third part of this discussion will be an opportunity to discuss tangible steps we can take as a community to support non-discrimination in Lincoln. This final part will not be recorded, so you're welcome to turn on your microphone and camera if you're comfortable doing so. I think that it helps with sort of more organic conversations, but I also did want to emphasize that your safety is, paramount here. So I think that clarifies who we are and what this space is intended to be. Thanks again for joining us. We're really glad that you could make it. And so, Aaron, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you now, whenever you're ready.
All right. Okay. So my face should be here. Mic should be on. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have people who know me know that I work in PowerPoint. And if you want to see this bigger, if you click on my window, it should make it full screen. But basically I just have a little bit of a guiding presentation here to help us kind of follow along. Like Mark said, I'm going to be talking about a little bit of the history of trying to get LGBTQ non-discrimination protections passed in Lincoln. And this is really a history of Lincoln's most recent efforts by a lot of different advocates to make Lincoln a place where we all can live, work, and play. So let's get going. So I think what helps is just understanding how we got to where we are. So I'm going to talk about kind of the history, like I said, and then I'll go a little bit deeper into what specifically is being discussed right now, like Mark said, what is called Title 11 or is been referred to as the Fairness Ordinance. So how did we get here? I got a little timeline for us. So if we go back 10 years to 2012, that is when something that was actually called the Fairness Ordinance was attempted. This effort was to bring LGBTQ plus non-discrimination policy, and it was a policy that only had sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes being introduced. So this was introduced and passed by the city council. There was an opposition effort that collected signatures, and they collected enough signatures to bring the ordinance to a citywide vote. The city council at that time led with a statement that basically declared that we do not vote on human rights, and they left the ordinance in suspense. At the same time that this was happening here in Lincoln, we were also seeing a similar LGBTQ plus non-discrimination ordinance passing and sticking in Omaha. Then about 5 years later, there is a effort by community advocates that a group of local advocates began putting pressure on our city leaders to take action to revisit this issue. And this is where there was ongoing work to show that there is support across the city for non-discrimination protections. And this was also building off of obviously longer efforts in the city of people living here to get protections, but this was a more recent revitalization of the effort. And then in about 2019, we got the question asked again, should we try again? So the city council and a lot of community advocates began to discuss what might be the right timing for another attempt. A lot of these discussions ended in a not yet, we need to consider some more things. And a lot of advocates were doing the work to educate the city council and others, allies, etc., on what would be needed for protections to stick. We know that also COVID, which is ongoing, but the COVID crisis that really came into play here in 2020 delayed action that might have happened in 2020. Then here we are in 2022. There is a city council effort again. So this time around, the city council introduced changes to Title 11. So changes to Title 11 were proposed, including updates to codify and clarify LGBTQ plus protections. These changes were 60 plus pages of changes to language and protections for veterans, active military, people with disabilities, people of color, and LGBTQ plus people, as well as just Lincoln in general. That was our 2022 effort that we're currently in the middle of. Is this Title 11 update effort. I have a cute little circle here that helps us kind of figure out on this time we're here. I wanted to go a little bit deeper into exactly what's been going on here with Title 11, since this is where it seems to be, that a lot of folks are confused about what is going on. So I've tried our best here to kind of outline the events that happened this year. So at the end of January, the Title 11 updates were introduced and there was a hearing. Title 11 is a part of the municipal code of the city that relates to the local Commission on Human Rights. Within it, there were 25 years of out-of-date language, so there was a lot of changes that needed to happen around that. The changes that also were introduced was an attempt to bring Lincoln into compliance with federal and state law. What we saw at this attempt also in the hearing, we saw an opposition in the public hearing that was really focused on LGBT people and a very specific focus on transgender people. We also saw that there was a focus on search and service animals and this idea that there are fines in the code of Title 11. We also saw some really great support for updating non-discrimination protections in the public hearing from a variety of community advocates, some LGBTQ plus orgs, mental health orgs, a couple of women rights orgs, people of color advocacy organizations, HIV advocates, veterans, as well as just everyday individuals who would be helped with these added protections. So after we saw the updates introduced, 2 weeks later, there is a city council vote. The city council voted to adopt the changes to Title 11. which, were all of the changes that we had talked about a little bit before, and I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit. This also was the time that started the opposition's so-called timer to try and force a citywide vote. So with that timer started, the next day on February 15th, the opposition began to collect signatures. Opponents to the updates to Title 11, due to city statute, they had this opportunity to try to force a citywide vote. So kind of the rules around that is they have 15 days following a vote by the city council to collect signatures on petitions, similar to what you might see going on right now around like raising the minimum wage, that you need to collect a certain number of signatures to put it on a ballot. So they had the opportunity to collect signatures to try to put it on a ballot. If they collected enough signatures, it would force a citywide vote if the city council determined to send it to the vote, but we'll get into that. So basically, yeah, they had this threshold to try and force a citywide vote. And what we saw, opponents to progress and opponents to LGBT people did as expected. We saw them spreading a lot of misinformation and hate about transgender people in our communities. As we continue on, a couple days later, then the opposition presented the signatures that they needed for verification. They needed about 4,000 signatures, and they were able to collect about 18,000. Then what we saw in the community was a bit of a community tragedy with the loss of a community member by suicide. So we lost a local advocate named Milo Winslow to suicide, and he had previously testified during the public hearing and was using his TikTok to do a lot of advocacy for LGBT people in general, for trans people especially, and to educate people on what was happening in Lincoln. And with that was a moment that caused the LGBT community a lot of understandably stress and grief, and is still impacting us as a whole. So following that, there were a number of community meetings held to come together, led by a variety of different advocates in the community, to hold these meetings to talk and share, grieve, listen to each other, educate, think about the paths forward and what we could do. As a lot of us were really hurting following both the presentation of signatures, the verification of signatures, and of the loss of a community member and a friend. So following some of those meetings throughout March, we had a little bit of quiet in April until about this last week. This is when we start to see the Lancaster Democrats pushing to rescind the ordinance. And what rescinding would do would be to just take it off the books, and the idea that it could be reintroduced later. So last Friday, the Stonewall Democrats issued a statement urging the city council to rescind, and also outlined some steps that would need to be taken before being reintroduced. And then likewise, today there was a similar statement that came out from the countywide Democrats, and a Lincoln Journal-Star article about that, a similar statement asking to rescind. Both of these were asking for a later attempt at the ordinance, doing it the right way, doing it very intentionally, making sure that there is a centering of more transgender voices, and ensuring that there was a very clear path to winning this ordinance fight. So this is what has gone on so far this year, which has been a lot. We are in this little spot. You might notice that this is 425. That was today. So things are still continuing to change and evolve. And we want to try and make sure that people kind of know what's going on, though it is hard to know for sure maybe the best path forward. This is the history of what has gone on so far in our city. So let's look at a little bit of like what's up with Title 11. What is more, what is inside of this? Title 11, like I had said earlier, it is a section of the municipal code, which doesn't sound very exciting. But we know that the municipal code for all cities have a lot of nuggets of important information. Title 11, in short, basically directs the city's Commission on Human Rights. It outlines public policies for employment, housing, accommodations, etc. It also outlines how to navigate grievances, moments of discrimination. What we know happens in practice is most end in a conversation with the Commission on Human Rights and the person wronged rather than court and fines. But the Title 11 does outline what a more formal process would be if needed, what court or fines would look like. The updates that we're looking at that were introduced this year was trying to do a lot of things at once. Like I said, there is over 60 pages of information and protections introduced. So again, it would add and update the non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, people living with disabilities, people of color, specifically by clarifying that hair discrimination is a part of race discrimination, and veterans and active military folks were also introduced in these protections. Pause one moment as I take a drink. Like I said, these updates would bring Lincoln into compliance with state and federal law. Like, for example, like I said, the hair type edition would bring Lincoln in compliance with state law that also protects, and federal law that I think was recently passed. We also know that, the update to the definition of sex and sex discrimination would better fit the ruling following the 2020 Bostock Supreme Court case, which that case, that was a lot of words that I threw at you there, but that case in 2020 ruled that employment discrimination against LGBTQ plus people classifies as sex discrimination. So the updated definitions of sex and sex discrimination in Title 11 follows along with that Supreme Court case. And like I said, within all of these updates also we're updating 25 years of outdated and or confusing language. There were also a lot of misconceptions about Title 11 and what it was introducing or what it would do. These were two big ones that came up a lot. There's a lot of misconceptions about what the fines pertained to, or like how much someone could be fined. Inside Title 11, because it's city code, there are some fines. And the code itself defines a maximum fine for breaking any of these discrimination codes. But what we know happens in practice is we rarely ever see a fine, if at all. Also very confusing to some folks, or maybe purposefully made to be confusing, is what qualifies as a public space under Title 11 and what Title 11 has authority over as the city. So the Commission on Human Rights in Lincoln has no authority over religious institutions like churches and church property, something that the opposition lied about. And also the Commission on Human Rights also doesn't have any authority over religious or public schools. So schools in general in Lincoln do not fall under the guidance of this city code. And this has to do with some technicalities where schools are under a different political subdivision. One of those kind of fun bureaucracy bits where they just belong to a different part of government. And then obviously how we got here had a lot to do with anti-LGBTQ and especially, again, anti-trans beliefs. We know that a lot of good legislation, code, or policy updates that protects LGBTQ people can get attacked by folks who hold anti-LGBTQ beliefs. Again, anti-queer and anti-trans beliefs are loud, hurtful, and persuasive. And we also know that there is a large movement across the country right now where anti-trans narratives and legislation are being pushed. So what we saw here is part of a larger movement against trans rights, just a little closer to home.
Let's see.
Recording is on.
Perfect. All right. Thank
Hey.
you.
Okay, so after kind of understanding how we got to this point, what seems to be also a bit of confusion is like, what is happening next? Where do we go from here? I don't have all the answers for this, but hopefully I can help to explain the different paths forward. It would be really, really easy if our path forward looked like a straightforward arrow, just a straightforward path, one answer, one way. But what it ultimately looks more like is a set of branching paths. So there are different options forward with their benefits, with their drawbacks, with different considerations that need to be taken. So I will try to explain the different paths forward. And, again, I myself, as well as, Out Nebraska doesn't have, we don't know exactly what the best path forward is going to be for a community, but we want to make sure that everyone is listening to each other and we're trying to figure it out together for, what is going to help us all and what will get us to the spot we want to be in. So let's go forward. What's our next steps? Well, one thing that we could do is that this ordinance could be rescinded. The ordinance could be rescinded and the city council could try again another year by introducing the same stuff with maybe a little bit more preparation. We could also go forward into a citywide vote. Now, this one also is not just a straightforward path, as this splits off into separate branches as well. If it goes forward into a citywide vote, there are additional considerations. It could fall in a special election before the general election in November. It could be, this whole Title 11 update could be voted on the ballot in November in the general election. It could be held, we could vote on this issue in a special election after the general election, after November, early next year. There are a lot of different paths forward for following through a vote. The city council could also try to revise the ordinance and try again with different language, with different adjustments, with less changes. We also know that the city council also has the option to do nothing, like they did in 2012. In 2012, I want to clarify, they did set forward a statement to say we do not vote on human rights. But in doing so, they also have left it on the books. So the fairness ordinance from 2012 still is lingering out there. It was not rescinded. It was not pushed forward. It still exists out there, technically. So I want to kind of just give people a second, kind of look through this. A lot of these decisions all of these decisions are based off what the city council decides to do next. But this is where we can make our voices heard in what we want to see happen. So kind of looking at what we can do, and we're going to have more time, like Mark said, at the end to talk to each other and kind of listen and hear what people's concerns are or what collectively as a community we want to see happen. But things we can consider, actions we can take now. what to know about, what we can do now is that the decision sits with the city council for that path forward. Again, that kind of branching path forward depends on what the city council decides. However, we can continue to make our voices heard by speaking to them. And I included the packet email here that sends it to the whole council. I can also pop it into the chat in a little bit when it's less awkward for me to copy and paste. There's also been a lot of community harm during this whole process this year. A lot of hurt aimed towards our trans community members. So we need to be there for each other as well. And on that, things that we can do that is a little bit more boots on the ground and things we can effectively do. We can reach out to our friends and family who are LGBTQ, to support them and to show that we're there for each other. Oh, thanks, Jackson. Jackson posted the Lincoln Council's email in the chat. We can also talk to our friends, our family, our neighbors, like this event, about what these protections would mean for our community, explain how we got to this point. We can, again, listen to each other as we share our stories, our struggles, and our experiences, really be an active listener to hear where everyone is coming from. We also can take that active stance of challenging myths and lies being spread in our communities and our neighborhoods about transgender people. All of us have a responsibility to speak out when we hear hateful things and things that are untrue. We also can be an active and educated voter for our communities, and this applies at every level. Just another way to get involved is to be involved in our local elections, to select people who we want, making decisions for us, as well as if this would ever go to a vote, being ready to get engaged ourselves and to get community engaged, if that is the branch forward. And then really what we can do right now is doing a lot of focus on community building and coalition building. Places like the Black Hat House is a great place to connect to like-minded individuals or people who are in your community, who want to do something, who want to have camaraderie as we navigate difficult situations. If you want something specifically to do, these are some suggestions, not things you have to do. But if you're like, well, this has made me a little bit fired up to do something, like we said, you can email the city council your thoughts about this ordinance and your thoughts about the path forward or the considerations that they need to think about no matter what they do. If you have your own story to share, those sorts of things. You can also write to our federal senators about the Equality Act, which is federal LGBTQ plus protections in employment, housing, banking, etc. If you would rather not have to deal with stuff at the local level, federal legislation would take care of that. And then also, continuing this conversation, right? Posting on our own social media or talking to our friends, talking about this event, talking about the conversations that we're going to have tonight, just to kind of keep people in the loop, try to help people see, make sense of a confusing and difficult situation. And it could also be something short and sweet to show your support for LGBT people and for trans people. Something as short and sweet as saying, like, I want to live in a city that's home to a diverse and thriving community, one that includes LGBT Lincolnites. These are just a few ideas of, small actions we can take right now, but obviously not the end all be all of what we can do. So that's kind of it for me talking about the variety of kind of like how we got here. I think now, Mark, this is that second part of the event. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can, maybe, where's my little button to stop sharing? Oh, there it is. Okay. So now you can see my face a little better.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really informative. I appreciated it. This is something that's really confusing to me personally, just keeping up on the process of how things become law and set, so I do appreciate that. As I said, sort of in our introduction, and I know we had some folks come in after that, we are only going to take questions via the chat so that we don't miss anybody, and also so that folks who are concerned about their confidentiality still have the opportunity to ask questions. So you can access the chat by clicking on there's a little speech bubble icon that is at the bottom of the screen. If you click on that, then the chat will pop up. There you'll see that Jackson has linked also the council packet email address so that you can send sort of a wide email to the city council. I also noticed that Lori pointed out like a news article about like the Crown Act being passed to protect race-based hair discrimination. So that's really cool. I was kind of moseying over this article too. Thank you for sharing that as well. And I think that also goes just to show how much Title 11 encompasses. It's not just trans people, it's not just LGBT people, but it's a whole variety of people, and so it's very important that this is supported, right? So I'll give just a moment, for folks to type out their questions if they want. Um,
Logistically, Mark and I had talked beforehand, since people might be typing questions at the same time, or people might be typing out a question as it is being answered. Mark is going to just read the questions to me like it's a discussion. And also, Mark, if you have an answer for the Black Cat House, feel free to answer it instead.
yeah, I'm totally happy to take any questions that you've got regarding this topic, or if you're interested in what Black Cat House does too as a way of supporting non-discrimination and out Nebraska for that matter. So feel free to put whatever your thoughts are in the chat. I do actually have kind of a question that I was kind of pondering during your presentation. And one of the things that, like we have all these paths forward, right? Like, it's not a straight line, nothing ever is. And so one of the things that I was kind of wondering is like, are there like some pros and cons for some of these paths that we take? Because everything's got options, right? And everything's got potential problems that can arise, as well as potential, benefits. Like, is it better for us? If that makes sense. So, is that something that you'd be able to elaborate on?
I can try to give some pros and cons. I am going to clarify again, like, I might miss something here that's a pro versus a con about a specific path forward. This is my understanding, and I think every path forward would take a lot more work to think through and to think about what all needs to be considered. But if I'm kind of going back through, actually, we make this kind of easy for us, right? Let me share the screen again, so everyone can kind of follow along with where I'm talking. Sorry, I'm having small technical difficulty in this moment. Okay. So our big branching path again, right? With many options for going forward. And this is like based on what the city council decides, but we can definitely pressure them to take whatever response that we think is best. We being collectively and also us individually. Rescinding the ordinance, and trying again another year. The pro would be that gives us more time to prepare. That gives us, for people who want this to pass, time to kind of come together, to clarify some things, to make sure that there's more framework ready to go to support if there needs to be a campaign. To have that campaign, to do a little bit more messaging that talks about, like how Mark was talking about, this affects a lot of people. And then, so there's the big benefit is like time there, and a chance to do it, again, or do it better. Like had been outlined by a couple different people and advocates, outlining ways to get more community involvement, all that sort of stuff that takes time. And then the kind of like con comes into play. The difficulty of doing it again is just doing it again. It's a lot of time and labor that has to happen again. It's also possible that we'll end up in the same or similar spot. where we might see opposition again, who we know is well funded and fueled by, you know, the ever burning fires of hate. Like, they might again collect enough signatures where we have to look again to say, okay, are we going to a vote? You know, and the worry there, for me personally, sometimes it's just like the emotional turmoil of having to do it again. Again, balance with the pro of we could do it again, but smarter. When we're looking at elections, again, the kind of pro and con depends on when it is. If it's sooner, the con is it's soon. And that takes a lot of time and energy and money to get people ready to go and ready to advocate, getting people educated about what's going on, getting people out to the polls, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like anything that comes into play with voting is just the logistics of voting. And the timelines of voting. The pros of voting is if it passes, we're done. But again, there's a lot of work that goes into making sure that people are educated about what they're voting on. There's always concerns about who's going to be voting, and is it going to be held during a time that, say, the youth in town are ready to vote. Young people who might be more likely to vote in favor of LGBT rights, are they going to be in town at college, or are they going to be out of town because it's the summer? So there's a couple of considerations with elections. Revising the ordinance, similar to rescinding, you get a chance to do it again, adjust some language. A big con with revising, my concern would be that it would be revised to not include the very things we are fighting over now that we need and want. My biggest concern with revising an ordinance is someone would convince them to remove LGBT protections, and that gets us back to square zero, where we'd have to try something else and try it again. But there might be some other language that could be removed to make the ordinance more palatable. But that starts to get a little bit into, kind of like politicsy, that I'm not really sure what they might be able to do to convince people to vote for it. And then, like in 2012, we could also take the path that is neutral-ish in doing nothing, or to say, well, we're not going to vote on this, and then don't rescind it, don't vote. That kind of ends us in a similar place that we're in right now, right? Where something else has to be introduced in the future, or eventually the city council has to vote to push it forward or take it back. So does that kind of answer your question, Mark, about like pros, cons, etc.?
Yeah, I do appreciate that. Thank you. Like I said, all these different paths forward, have their potential issues and stuff. And I think I'm glad that you also elaborated on some of the stuff that was giving me a bit of anxiety. Like, are we going to be written out if it is rewritten, right? So we do have a question in the chat. This one's coming from Natalie. I'm just going to read this verbatim. Hi, Aaron. I'm sure you're aware of where this will be probably going from me. I have a series of questions if I can be indulged. First, is it OutNebraska's position that moving forward with the fairness ordinance language was responsible without funding and a campaign apparatus?
I'm reading back through this to make sure that I understand. Is it OutNebraska's position that moving forward? I can't speak for like all about Nebraska, but I think, where I'm coming from, definitely having more funding would have made a lot of things this year more smoother. Having, if there was a larger campaign around this, there were certain aspects that I think things could have been challenged, or we could have shown more support as a community, as a collective, coalition of people who believe that LGBTQ people belong in Nebraska, belong in Lincoln, and deserve protections. Having, some funding backup is always good for that. Like I said, when we're looking at elections and moving people to elections, that always takes a bit of, time, effort, money, etc. So hopefully that helps to answer a little bit of your question. I think it's kind of a larger question about, do we need funding to do action like this, we being a collective of like anyone who wants to have progressive or LGBT positive things pass, funding often needs to be associated. What do we got next, Mark?
All right. Let's see. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the questions as they appear in order,
Cool.
just because I think that's fair for everybody. So Lori asks, in regard to the general or November election, do you know if there is any potential for anti-LGBTQA plus legislation like the Don't Say Gay discriminatory legislation in Florida, or will the ordinance be the main issue to focus upon?
So the question here has to do with kind of two parts: November election and kind of like, are we thinking there might be Don't Say Gay stuff, kind of like we saw in Florida? So at least for things that would appear on a ballot this year, we know it would have to be something that, is either already in the works having a petition, or it would be something like these updates that could appear on a November ballot. So like there's a lot of statewide ballot petitions circulating around, let's see if I can remember all of the different ones. There's like several around legalizing marijuana. There's one about raising the minimum wage in Nebraska. There's one about adding voter ID that would require people to present some sort of photo ID to vote. So those are sorts of things that we could see as like a ballot petition addition, as that rhymes, in November, depending on if they collect enough signatures by, I believe the cutoff is July. And then the second part of your question, I'm kind of separating it because you asked about if it would be possible to see like Don't Say Gay stuff appearing on the ballot itself. That is pretty unlikely from what I understand, because like what we saw in Florida, that legislation was led by the legislature there. Nebraska's legislature has ended blissfully for the year, unless there's a special section. Knock on all the wood you have. So because we kind of have stuff early in the year, we just keep an eye out from the beginning of the year for dangerous legislation, like something that might be like a Don't Say Gay bill, or like a curriculum censorship bill. That's kind of what that is. I would say that would be something to keep an eye out for next year, January, February, being wary about seeing a education censorship bill like what we saw in Florida, as that would have to go through the legislature. It could come through a city council, or it could come through like a school board policy. All the more reason to be involved with your local elections, to know who the people are you're voting for, in those more hyper local positions. Hopefully that kind of answers the question that you had, Lori.
Okay. Thank you. So we have another question from Natalie, her series of questions. So she writes, is it Out Nebraska's position that moving forward with fairness ordinance language without funding and a campaign apparatus was dangerous, especially for trans people?
Go ahead and read her next question, because I think they're related.
Yeah, sure. And so why did Out Nebraska support moving forward with fairness ordinance language while knowing that there was no funding or campaign organization worked on before introduction?
So these are some bigger questions kind of about like specifically Out Nebraska's position with why we testified in support at the city council hearing, as we were one of a couple organizations that were there on that day. I can't speak for like all of Out Nebraska, and I can't speak for entirely like a decision made by the board. We make decisions based on what we're supporting when it comes to legislation and stuff like this, based on discussions with our board representatives. And so if you have more questions about that, maybe it'd be best that I can help you connect with the board to have some discussions, because maybe that can help to clarify some things. I think that when we're looking at, you know, what we could have done, what we should have done, what we would have done, knowing, you know, what might have happened this year, there are a lot of different spots that we all can say, well, I would have done something else, or this organization should have done something else, or if we could have done this other thing, we would have. What I myself am more concerned about in these points in time is worrying about, like, where are we right now? Because I can spend all day going back, right? I could spend the next 2 weeks talking with you about all the different spots that I could have done something different, that maybe Nebraska could have stepped in, that the city council could have stepped in, that a different organization could have stepped in, that we could have avoided having, you know, this person or that organization involved in X, Y, and Z. And it's a discussion that I worry that we're spending a lot of time on when we have a very, like, you know, fragile situation right now, trying to figure out what the next step is to go forward. I think, you know, there's a lot of things we could say, well, in hindsight, we should have done this or we could have done that. As a trans person myself, certainly this has been very hard on me, as I think it has been for others in the room who are also trans, or for our larger trans community. So I don't have all the answers for you. And for that, I'm sorry, I don't have all the answers you're hoping for or looking for. If you want to have a more, like, put together Nebraska statement on, you know, where we're at or what has happened over the last couple of months, we have a recent statement that is on our webpage that I'll post below. And again, you know, hopefully that can answer some questions. I know it's not going to answer everything, though. And I wish I had every answer that would make everything better, safer, and, you know, I wish I had all the answers for you. I really do. And I'm sorry I don't have all the answers for you that, you know, you're looking for. I did post in the chat if you want to see kind of where Nebraska is at and what we're asking for the city council to do next. I put that in the chat for kind of where Nebraska's stance is right now.
So I also want to note real quick, we are going to get some more questions, but probably in the next 15, 20 minutes, we're going to try and move to the third part of our conversation. So just letting folks know that we might not get to all the questions in the chat. We are recording them elsewhere so that we can add on to this video if necessary, so that when it's spread around and publicly posted, those questions will still be made available in public. So just wanted to note that. That said, scrolling back up here. So we have a question. If it is rescinded, does that mean the city council would have to put it to a vote before the city council again? I think that's what the CC in there stands for. So
yeah, so if they rescind the Title 11 updates as it is right now, that basically, I've been saying, like, on the books, as if it's like a physical thing. Hopefully that analogy kind of made sense, but basically, like, they rescind it, they're taking it back. So it's not anywhere that can be voted on, right, by the city council or beyond. They would need to reintroduce it either as is again or with changes. So then we'd have to go through the same process of the city council would introduce it. There'd be a public hearing. There'd be 14 days for people to also write in what they think and what they want to see. Excuse me. And then there would be another vote by the city council. And again, then that starts the timer for anyone who wants to oppose it. Lincoln is very unique in that our city has this weird timer that says if anyone dislikes something the city council has done that they voted on, you can collect signatures to put it to a citywide vote, which is good and bad. In an ideal world, it's used to check any city council that goes rogue. what we've seen, though, it's used a lot by bad actors to take aim at stuff like LGBT rights.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have another one. Has there been any conversation about starting a 501c4 or 6 that would join forces for certain agendas, legalize marijuana, pro-choice, LGBTQIA rights, etc.? Maybe call it the Nebraska Forward Alliance, leaving organizations out flapping in the wind on their own in funding and expect counterattack in issues. So I like that. I'm not going to lie, I like that. Go ahead, though.
Yeah, I'm with Mark where like I personally I don't know of any like effort to do something like that, but I would love to see personally. I would love to see something like that, right? Something that could have a little bit more funding and a little bit more lobbying power. Because the question here for people who are a little unfamiliar, if you're a 501c4 or C6, you have different funding allowances when it comes to lobbying. And lobbying includes basically any time that you are talking to a representative and trying to convince them to do something, to vote on something, to introduce legislation on something. But it also counts towards like ballot petitions. Like I had mentioned, like there's the raise the wage ballot petition. There's other ballot petitions around marijuana legalization. That stuff also is lobbying, as except at that point, like the legislature or the legislators are us, the citizens of Nebraska. So yeah, I am not familiar with an effort to do something like that, but if you have a lot of money and you want to start one, I think a lot of people will be all for it.
The potential for T-shirts, right? Like the good NFA. Um, um, so I'm going to take, there's two questions left that I'm going to go ahead and take. Then after that, I think we're going to go ahead and move to the third part. If you have questions, go ahead and feel free to continue putting them in the chat. We'll address them as like a separate sort of thing. You know, we'll edit it together with some magic later. So what is OutNebraska's current position regarding the Fairness Ordinance, rescind, table, continue support, and why?
So again, the most recent kind of stance about Nebraska, I linked in the chat. Please check that out. Again, this might not be the answer you want to hear. I'm going to give you the answer that I do have. Our stance right now is the city council needs to listen to us. It needs to listen to us, the community, not out Nebraska, but us as a community, us as individuals, us as LGBT people, us as trans people, us as people who would be affected by whatever decision they make. And that they really need to seriously consider what they're going to do, what they want to do, and they need to think about all of the implications, the pros, the cons, any harms caused to the community, what a campaign would bring, that if it would bring more hate, what that would look like, and what sort of community support would need to be in place. So, again, it is not, maybe not the exact answer you wanted to hear, but that is the answer that I do have. So thank you for asking that, by the way. Thank you.
All right. And last question, just for just for this video, or this specific moment in time. It says, howdy, are there any plans to hold more community conversations where LGBTQ people can have a small or large group discussions about this ordinance? I feel like there are a lot of people in our community who aren't on the same page about this ordinance regarding its history in Lincoln, campaign research, and impact it can have or has had on trans people. I honestly don't think we're going to find consensus, but it may be helpful to have further discussions between community members so LGBTQ plus people really know what the impact of pursuing this ordinance could mean. More generally, these could be opportunities for community building too. Thank you for answering that. Hopefully, we can kind of get the ball rolling with part 3 of our very exciting series in this meeting. So, Aaron.
Yeah, the shortest answer is in 5 minutes. The Black Cat House has generously offered their space to host that sort of discussion, to talk about how we got here, things we need to think about and consider going forward. both as LGBT people and our allies, and as advocates just in the community, et cetera, like all of us here. So, and I know also the person who asked this was one of the great community advocates who helped organize one of the other community meetings that a lot of people found very useful and very valuable, and just a great space to come together for. So, other than this discussion that's happening shortly, I don't know of more plans, but I am hoping that there will continue to be people who want to have these discussions. If that is something that you know you might want Out Nebraska to host, or you want another organization like Black Cat House to host, I think reaching out to groups that you think could host a space, whether virtually or in person, is always great to just like poke us to be like, hey, I think we need more of this. Um, again, like all of us can't be everywhere. So if you know that there needs to be more discussion, or because I agree with you, like we definitely need to have more discussion around this as a community. Um, just reach out to people, and maybe you and I can connect afterwards to kind of talk more about what this might look like, or another time we could host something like this. So thank you for asking that. I think that's kind of the end of the questions. Mark, is that it?
Yep, that's right. At least for the ones that we're going to address tonight. But like I said, feel free to continue posting in the chat. Right now, I'm going to lift my iron fist over the attendees. And so I'm going to go ahead and allow folks to start your video and unmute. Again, don't feel pressure to do so, whatever you're most comfortable with. And so hopefully we can kind of get some conversation going, get some momentum going for what steps we can take tangibly. I'm going to remind folks this is a public meeting. I don't know who's going to be here and what they're going to say. However, folks who are here for maybe not so great reasons are going to be kicked. That doesn't, and I'm mostly talking about like the other NFA. Yeah, you get what I mean. So, all right, you're free. So feel free to turn on your videos and mute and unmute if you so desire. Let's see, and then we can get some conversations going. Thank you for watching this video recording of a past event at the Black Cat House. If you're interested in learning more about who we are and what we do, please visit theblackcathouse.org. Thank you.